The year is 1315. The fire has gone out. Outside, the wind howls like a cursed spirit through the branches of dead apple trees. Inside, a man is trying not to die. He's not a nobleman or a knight. He owns no land, holds no title. His name is Thomas. No one will remember him. But tonight, like thousands of others across Europe, he lies awake on a lice-infested straw mattress, covered in a thin wool blanket, listening to his children's teeth chatter in the dark. The winter has arrived early. The crops failed in the summer. The granary is nearly empty. And outside, wolves are returning to villages that once pushed them into the forests. Medieval peasants didn't just live in a different world. They survived in one we would barely recognize. A world where time moved slower, where winter wasn't a season, it was a test, a gauntlet, a yearly reckoning, and most didn't pass it unscathed. You might be tempted to imagine a sort of rustic coziness. Smoke curling from thatched roofs, warm soup by the fire, laughter echoing in candlelit cottages. That's the myth. The reality is far less romantic and far more fascinating. To survive the coldest nights, peasants had to deploy everything they had. Every crumb of knowledge passed down from generations, every superstition, every tool, every ounce of bodily warmth. And sometimes, even then, it wasn't enough. But this isn't just a story about surviving winter. It's about living on the knife's edge of existence. About what happens when you're cold, hungry, powerless, and still have to carry on. So let's begin. Not at the castle gates, but at the foot of a pigsty, ankle-deep in frozen mud. At the heart of every medieval village was not the church, nor the market, but the hearth. A simple fire pit. It burned day and night in a central room, around which the family, and sometimes their animals, clustered like moths to a weak flame. The fire was survival. Let it die and you might die with it. Matches wouldn't exist for centuries. Starting a fire from scratch was a painstaking ordeal involving flint, steel, dry tinder, and a lot of praying. That's why fires were almost never allowed to go out. A peasant family would bank the embers under ashes at night, carefully preserving the glow. In the morning, the housewife would dig through the ashes with cold fingers, blowing gently, coaxing flame back to life like a midwife delivering fire. It was the first task of the day. Every day, and they needed that fire. Not just for warmth, but to cook what little food they had left, to keep mold and rot at bay, and to dry the sodden clothes they couldn't afford to replace. Inside a peasant's cottage, warmth was communal. One bed, sometimes two if they were lucky, crammed with bodies. Parents, children, sometimes an elderly grandparent or a sickly uncle. Infants slept between bodies to prevent freezing. Blankets were rare. Fur was precious and usually worn, not laid out. They shared heat, breath, even lice. Sometimes they brought animals indoors, especially pigs or chickens, who generated warmth and were easier to protect from thieves inside than out. Imagine sleeping inches from a restless hog that might trample your toddler if it got spooked. The floor? Packed earth, sometimes strewn with rushes or hay to soak up human waste, vomit, blood. These rushes were changed perhaps once a year. Rats and fleas loved them, and still this was preferable to the howling night. Europe's winters weren't always brutal, but between 1300 and 1850, something changed. The continent entered what we now call the Little Ice Age. Temperatures dipped, seasons shifted, harvests failed. The River Thames froze. So did the Baltic Sea. Frost fairs were held on frozen rivers. But while nobles skated and danced, peasants starved and froze. Before this climatic shift, surviving winter was already difficult. Now it became nearly impossible. In a typical year, peasants stockpiled food through the fall. Salted pork, pickled cabbage, root vegetables buried in pits. But a bad harvest meant these stores ran dry by January. In the famine years, like 1315 through 1317, it was worse. People ate tree bark, clay, leather boiled into soup. In Ireland, it was recorded that people ate their own dead. In Poland, mothers were said to abandon children in the woods like old fairy tales, but with real hunger behind them. The average medieval peasant consumed between 2,000 and 3,000 calories a day when food was available. During the winter, that number could drop sharply, especially if they had to do the same work in the fields. You didn't get days off just because your hands were turning blue. But some peasants adapted in ways both ingenious and strange. Clothing was the first line of defense, but it was crude. Undyed wool was most common, itchy, heavy, and rarely waterproof. Undergarments made of linen were a luxury. Layers were everything. You'd wear 2 or 3 tunics if you had them, with straw stuffed between for insulation. Cloaks were handed down through generations, threadbare and patched. Shoes? Wooden clogs or leather if you were lucky. Wool wrappings helped keep feet from going completely numb, though frostbite was common. There are accounts from monastic infirmaries describing blackened toes falling off during Lent. And yet, people still traveled. To markets, to church, to neighboring villages. Roads were ice-rutted traps. But you had to go. Social life didn't stop because of snow. In fact, winter brought its own kind of rituals. The long nights became a canvas for storytelling, myth-making, and fear. Without heat or entertainment, families passed the hours by recounting tales. Of witches who stole babies from cradles. Of bog spirits and the wild hunt. Spectral horsemen who galloped through forests, bringing doom. Superstition didn't die out in the cold. It grew stronger. You'd chalk sigils on doors. Nail rowan branches above thresholds. Sleep with iron under your pillow to ward off evil. And you'd never go outside after dark. The cold wasn't the only thing that might kill you. The darkness held memories. Old fears. Wolves, once hunted to extinction in many places, returned. Their howls were not romantic, but terrifying. In parts of France, they carried away children. In others, they scavenged battlefields, then turned on villages. In 1420, the wolves of Paris were so aggressive that citizens organized armed hunts within the city walls. Against this backdrop, peasants found comfort in religion, or at least the rituals of it. Candlemas, Epiphany, Advent, they punctuated the winter, gave it rhythm. You'd go to church, kneel in the cold stone nave, see your breath as you sang hymns. Not for warmth, but for hope. And what of love? Of intimacy in the frost? Continued, quietly. Marriages happened in winter, not because it was romantic, but because it was practical. Crops didn't need tending. People were indoors. And the cold made closeness not just desirable, but necessary. New babies were often conceived in the coldest months, born in late summer when food was more plentiful. Sex was a warmth of its own. But it was also tied to fear. Childbirth was deadly. Feeding another mouth was a gamble. Every new child was a new liability when the porridge thinned. Still, life went on. People laughed, sang, drank ale that had frozen in the barrel and thawed again. They celebrated saints whose names are now forgotten. They lit candles against the void. But here's the twist. For all their suffering, peasants had something many of us have lost. They knew how to endure. They understood their land intimately. Its rhythms, its threats, its gifts. They passed down knowledge not in books, but in habit. How to insulate a home using dried moss between planks. How to find the warmest spot in a barn. Which herbs helped ward off winter sickness. How to store apples in pits so they'd last until March. Even the architecture of their huts told a story. Low ceilings to trap heat. Tiny windows to keep the wind out. South-facing doors to catch what little sun they had. Nothing was wasted. Not even time. You didn't waste daylight. You didn't waste warmth. You didn't waste breath. And when someone died, you buried them quickly, before the ground froze. It's tempting to see these people as victims, of weather, of class, of ignorance. But they were also survivors. They endured with grit, humor, and quiet strength. Their world was small, but their resilience was vast. They didn't have heated floors or fleece blankets. No down jackets. No electric lights, but they had songs, stories, hands that knew how to coax life from frostbitten earth. They knew how to wait, to hope, to persist. And on the coldest nights, when the wind screamed and the fire dimmed, they didn't cry out in despair. They drew their loved ones close. They whispered prayers or jokes or lullabies. They slept not because it was safe, but because they must. And in the morning, if the fire still glowed and the sun rose pale behind snow-heavy skies, they began again. So the next time you feel a chill, remember, someone once survived worse, with less, for longer, and they left behind not monuments or empires, but the quiet, enduring proof that life can go on, even in the coldest of nights. That's not boring history, that's the history that kept the world alive. Morning in a medieval village wasn't announced by sunlight. It was announced by pain, creaking spine, aching joints stiff from the night's cold, the dull throb of chilblains on raw, red fingers, a child coughing in the dark. The world woke up slowly, reluctantly, and often in silence, because words, like firewood, weren't wasted unless necessary. Thomas, our peasant, stirred before the rest. His breath fogged in front of his face. The fire was still alive, barely, a red glow beneath a layer of ash. He whispered a word of thanks to no one in particular, then reached for a stick of kindling as his wife, Alice, stirred under the woolen pile of bodies they called a bed. Their daily miracle wasn't just that they survived the coldest nights. It was that they woke up ready to survive the coldest days. Winter work didn't stop. The rhythms of the land might have slowed, but the obligations never did. The Lord still demanded his due. Rents, labor, livestock, taxes collected in coin, kind, or time. If the ground wasn't frozen solid, you dug ditches. You cleared paths. You repaired fences. If snow fell, you shoveled it, not out of comfort but to keep access to grain stores, pig pens, and outhouses. The manor reeve, a kind of peasant foreman appointed by the Lord, would make his rounds even on frostbitten mornings. You'd see his shape emerge from the white fog, cloak crusted with hoarfrost, and you knew then, no excuses. Not even winter excused you, and yet there were moments of reprieve. Midwinter was marked by feasts, brief flares of joy in a season of stillness. Take Christmas, or rather, Christmastide, a 12-day period of celebration, marked not by gifts, but by meat. Ale, a rare moment when even peasants might taste goose or beef if the Lord was feeling generous, or if a pig had died from the cold. Yule logs were burned. Wassail, hot cider spiced with cinnamon and drunk from communal bowls, warmed frozen hands. Songs were sung not in harmony, but in raucous, slurred groups. You weren't celebrating the birth of a Messiah so much as the stubbornness of human joy. And then there was the Feast of Fools, a day when rules inverted. Peasants dressed as bishops. Drunken men delivered mock sermons. Laughter, for one glorious night, replaced fear. But come morning, reality returned. Hunger gnawed, cold pierced. Water, that most basic need, could become a threat in winter. Wells froze. Buckets cracked. Ice grew over streams like glass skin. Peasants had to break through it daily, hauling water with numb hands, praying they wouldn't slip and fall in. Falling into a stream in January was often a death sentence. Wet wool offered no protection. Hypothermia was a fast and silent killer. Your heart would slow. Your breath would shorten. You'd get sleepy, then stop waking altogether. The bodies of those who died weren't always buried right away. The ground was stone hard. Sometimes they were kept in barns, wrapped in cloth, until a thaw allowed for burial. There are records of villagers storing the dead like firewood. But humans weren't the only ones suffering. Animals were crucial to peasant life, but they, too, were vulnerable. Cows and oxen were sheltered in makeshift byres. Chickens huddled together under baskets of straw. Horses, if a peasant had one, were blanketed in old cloths, their water troughs kept liquid with heated stones. And pigs, those warm, intelligent, filthy creatures, were often kept inside homes not just for warmth, but because they were more valuable than furniture. A pig could feed a family through winter. Its fat was rendered into lard. The skin boiled down for glue. Even its bladder might be turned into a crude toy for children. Nothing was wasted, not even the smell. Children in winter became both a blessing and a burden. They ate often more than their bodies could justify. But they also worked. By the age of 6 or 7, a child might be tasked with keeping the fire alive, watching the animals, fetching water, helping their mother with spinning or cooking. But winter brought a unique danger for them: boredom. Idle hands in cold cottages led to mischief and sometimes disaster. A spilled bucket of water could freeze a floor. A dropped ember could set a thatch roof ablaze. Fire, as much as it was salvation, could be the death of an entire household. There are tales, not moral fables, but recorded tragedies, of entire families lost to house fires started by unattended children. The wind would carry sparks. Dry thatch was eager fuel. The village might watch the flames from afar. But by the time they arrived, it would be too late. And then there were the sick. Medieval medicine in winter was a desperate guess, cloaked in prayer. The cold aggravated every illness. Coughs turned to fevers. Minor wounds turned septic. Peasants believed in balancing the humors. Blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Cold, they thought, was an excess of phlegm. So you were given garlic, mustard plasters, or strong vinegar to dry it out. Bleeding was common, cutting a vein to release the sickness. So was cautery, burning the skin to drive out spirits. In truth, most remedies were worse than the disease. But they were all people had, and still some survived, recovered, lived on. A testament, again, to resilience more than remedy. But resilience had limits. The Great Famine of 1315 wasn't just a footnote. It was a crisis so widespread, so catastrophic, that it reshaped an entire generation. It began with torrential rains, then crop failure, then livestock disease. Grain rotted in the fields. Ice spoiled. Salt, used to preserve meat, was so scarce that entire barrels of pork turned rancid. People ate dogs, cats, birds, leather. Some accounts, controversial but persistent, mention cannibalism, not in metaphor but in law court records. One chronicler writes that children were snatched from roadsides and roasted. But even in that darkest winter, some flicker of structure remained. Peasants turned to one another, shared what little they had, built soup fires in the common square, boiling nettles, weeds, whatever remained. The communal instinct didn't vanish, it just grew teeth. They had learned, alone you die. Together you might just live. And through all of this, time moved in strange ways. Days were short, but nights were endless. There was no clock. Time was measured by the sun, the fire, the toll of the church bell. You didn't count hours. You counted tasks. How long it took to strip a chicken, to card wool, to mend a torn boot, to warm a stone in the fire and place it under your blanket, praying it stayed hot long enough to lull you to sleep. Dreams, too, were different. You didn't dream of wealth. You dreamed of warmth, of spring, of bread, of not having to wake in the middle of the night to pee in a frozen pot. And in some moments, even then, there was peace. The turning point came every year quietly. It wasn't dramatic. The snow didn't melt overnight. The sun didn't blaze down from a suddenly blue sky. It was subtler. The first day the wind didn't howl. The first morning you didn't see your breath quite so clearly. The drip of water from the eaves. A sprout pushing through thawed earth like a miracle. Children would run barefoot again, even if it wasn't safe. Chickens would roam. Fields would beckon. And the fire, once the center of all life, would burn lower, less urgently. Spring was not salvation. It was just the next challenge. But for those who had made it, who had survived the coldest nights, the worst was over. For now. So what do we take from their story? Not pity, not superiority, but awe, because every comfort we enjoy today, our heating, our insulation, our thick socks and hot chocolate, rests on the backs of people who endured unthinkable hardship with almost nothing. They didn't call themselves heroes. They weren't remembered in books, but they kept going. And in doing so, they carried the thread of history through winter after winter, into a world they'd never lived to see. Our world. And now, as you drift towards sleep, wrapped in blankets, safe and warm, remember, once, not so long ago, survival was not guaranteed. And yet, they did it. Quietly, fiercely, in the darkest, coldest nights, they endured. And because of that, we are here. The wind was not just sound. It was language. It whispered through gaps in wooden walls, told stories in the creak of beams, murmured to sleepers about spirits that moved in the dark. In the medieval mind, winter was not passive. It was alive. It had moods. Punished. Judged. You didn't just dress for winter. You appeased it. This is why peasants didn't just wear wool. They adorned themselves with symbols. A bit of iron sewn into a sleeve. A string of dried garlic around the neck. A piece of coal tied to a belt to ward off demons who crept through cracks in the doorframe. Because if your baby died in the night, it might be the cold, or it might be something else. Birth and death lived side by side in the medieval world, especially during the long winters. In a home of 1 or 2 rooms, separated by no more than a curtain, a woman could be giving birth while her grandfather lay dying. Life did not wait for space or comfort, and the midwife, often a local woman not officially trained, but with knowledge passed down from her mother and her mother before, was a figure of reverence and fear. She knew herbs. She knew prayers. She knew what to do when the child came out silent. She also knew when the mother would not survive the night. Some peasants believed that childbirth in winter was dangerous not just because of the cold, but because the veil between worlds was thinner. That souls might slip away more easily. That ghosts came into the house when the fire dimmed too low. And so, after birth, they salted the baby. Not just to clean it, but to protect it. Meanwhile, outside, the forest didn't sleep. Even in the dead of January, it stirred with life. Foxes, martens, boars rooting under the snow. Peasants trapped what they could, not for sport but for survival. A single rabbit could mean stew for 2 days, but hunting without permission was poaching. And poaching was theft, from the Lord, who claimed dominion over every tree, every stream, every bird in the hedgerow. Get caught and you might lose more than the animal. The punishment for poaching ranged from fines to mutilation. First offense? Perhaps a beating. Second? The loss of a hand. Third? Well, no one got a third, so some stole anyway. They hunted by moonlight, set silent traps, dug pitfall holes lined with brambles and bones. Not because they were criminals, but because they were fathers, mothers, sons. Starvation doesn't ask about legality, and when they ate, they did so in silence. Carefully. A rabbit was boiled so long that the bones softened into pulp, and the broth, rich, oily, warm, was passed from mouth to mouth. No one wasted a drop. Even the pot, scraped and licked, would smell of meat for days. A child might sleep with it, dreaming of food. Time passed strangely in winter. You might think the nights were nothing but sleep, but that's a modern idea. In truth, medieval people often slept in 2 shifts. First sleep began at dusk. A few hours later, they'd wake and remain awake for an hour or 2, called the watch, before slipping back into a second sleep until dawn. What did they do during the watch? They prayed. They stirred the fire. They talked softly, sometimes made love. The world was dark, but not entirely asleep. Dreams and waking blurred. It was a liminal time, a sacred time, the kind of hour where you could almost believe the old stories, that the dead came to visit, that witches walked beneath the moonlight, that the cold itself had a voice and a memory. And still, even in the depths of winter, there was laughter, crude jokes shared over empty bowls, gossip whispered between frozen lips, children with red noses and chapped cheeks laughing at a pig who farted while sleeping. Joy in small doses was medicine. It had to be, because the plague would come. Not yet, but soon. Black Death waited only a generation away, and when it came, it would make even the harshest winters look like mercy. But our peasants did not know that. All they knew was frost, hunger, the silence of the dead, and the sharp, defiant sound of laughter in the face of it. We tend to think of peasants as powerless, but the truth is more complicated. They didn't rule, no, but they resisted. They broke curfews. They told irreverent stories about their lords. They brewed ale in secret. They carved obscene symbols into wood for protection. They danced barefoot in the frost, laughing at curses, daring the cold to claim them. And sometimes they fought back. There were uprisings, local revolts, a hayfork raised in anger against a steward who taxed them too deeply. A priest stabbed behind the altar for siding with the nobles. Rare, yes, but not unheard of. Winter may have crushed them, but it also hardened them. And when spring finally came, it was not always relief. Thawed roads meant the return of tax collectors. Thawed graves meant reburials. The snow that melted too quickly could flood homes, drown livestock. And sometimes, the warmth revealed what the cold had hidden. Rot, mold, the smell of death. But there were signs of hope, too. The first green shoots, the cries of lambs, the wet, rich smell of thawed soil. And then, Finally, the first morning when you woke up and didn't see your breath. That was the moment. The one you carried with you all year. Because no matter what followed, you had survived the coldest night. And that was no small thing. So if you've made it this far, still listening, still lying warm under your blankets, let this thought carry you. The world you live in now was built by people who endured the worst nature had to offer and kept going. They did not write history books, but they were history. They tilled the frozen fields, boiled snow for water, whispered stories in the night, carried their dead to frozen ground. And when the fire burned low, they leaned in close to one another and waited for dawn. If you ever feel the cold creeping in, remember they felt it too, and they lived.